So let's talk about the troops choices and battle line infantry of Warhammer 40K, with a look at how well each faction's grunts and objective grabbers stand up in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking troops and battle line, taking a look through each faction's options. In the game's history, there's often been a bit of a challenge trying to keep the basic troops relevant in game, particularly given that by definition they kind of shouldn't really be the best damage dealers in the army, otherwise that'd make the elite units and heavy hitters just not really feel all that exciting. So instead generally needs to have advantages for objectives or utility purposes. Games Workshop have tried all sorts of things in the past. In 8th edition they were tied to command points basically, and they were mandatory to fill detachment slots many times before that, and they've also often had bonuses to securing objectives, particularly the objective secured rule, which was kind of massive back in 9th edition, where they literally beat anything else that was trying to take that point, even if say it was one Orc boy versus a whole squad of Space Marine Terminators, and could be a bit weird from time to time. In 10th edition though, they redesigned things quite a lot. The only real intrinsic difference with them is the battle line rule, which gives you the option to take 6 squads rather than 3, though often they tend to be good in small numbers but not really things that you'd want to spam too much. They tend to have objective control too, or better objective control than the other units in the faction, which I think feels a little bit better than the sort of all or nothing approach that they had with objective control. I feel like 10th did that system really quite well. And then beyond that, they often tend to have interesting datasheet abilities, often things that might revolve around generating the armor's unique resource, say blessings of corn for the World Eaters, or maybe being extra good for say reanimation for Necron warriors. But lots of the rules also revolve around objectives, either maybe getting the sticky objectives rule, which means that you can capture a point and hold on, or say getting damage or defense buffs if you happen to be targeting things on a point. I feel like for the troops and battle line units it's often the special rules that keep them relevant more so than the damage profiles, and that often means that to get maybe 1 or 2 copies of that rule on the table, you might want to take some but not loads. There's definitely exceptions though. At the start of the edition I felt like it was maybe a bit rocky, but in general most of them really are quite playable right now. Games Workshop has had a whole bunch of time for both points and rules adjustments since the edition came out. In this video I'm going to go through every single battle line unit in the game, if quite briefly. There are quite a lot to get through, and talk about what they bring to the table and roughly how I'd rate them as stacking up right now. Let's go through in order and start with the Imperium, then move on to Chaos and Xenos. First up for the Space Marines we've got the Intercessor squad at 80 points per 5 of them. These guys are your standard 2 wound Space Marines with a 3+ save. They have a Power Fist on the Sergeant, a Astartes grenade launcher for a bit of extra punch, and the objective secured rule with the sticky objectives, often meaning that that's really quite a big draw to get them in the army list in the first place, at least marking your home objective and then moving on, and pretty handy as well if you can get it on the go on the mid board later on. Intercessors were a bit more of a maybe choice before, but Games Workshop gave them a rather spectacular damage boost with target elimination. Their bolt rifles go to basically 4 shots each at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1 all the way out to 24-inch range if they all focus fire on the same target, which usually they're going to want to anyway. It does make them kind of ridiculous and much better small arms fire than the vast majority of troops out there. They absolutely shred light infantry. Even with this though, most people haven't been spamming them or anything. It still usually makes sense to maybe just take a small unit or 2 to help deal with those kind of targets and provide sticky objectives, and they're still not exactly going to change the world against tough stuff. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10. For the Assault Intercessors, they've got a similar sort of stat line but 75 points per 5. The Sergeant will likely take a Power Fist or Thunder Hammer once again, and they strike with some AP 1 bolt pistols and then a flurry of chainsword attacks with 4 attacks at strength 4, AP 1, damage 1. Their special rule is re-rolling wound rolls of 1 or all wound rolls against things on objectives, and that makes them extra good for scrapping for the mid-board, and particularly with an attached character where they'll often have say a Space Marine Captain or something else nasty attached, where those big full wound rolls can make a huge difference. Blood Angels in particular really get on with them and I rate them higher there. They really can strike incredibly hard when they're attacking with strength 6 and 5 attacks on the charge. I've given them an 8 out of 10, still very usable and can be joined by other cheap fighty Space Marine characters or things that just want a cheap retinue. Maybe things like Azrael or Uriel Ventris could be a good option for them. Next up we've got the Heavy Intercessor squad, 110 points per 5 of these guys. They bring a big objective control but also the very chunky Gravis stat line. 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save. They got the big boost in terms of bolt rifles in the balance update, 2 shots at strength 5, AP 1, damage 2, so kind of the heavy bolter profile there, though they do also get a heavy bolter as well mixed into the unit. Their special rule just helps double down against small arms. Anything with damage 1 is -1 to the AP, so extra durable against them even above their normal very tough rates. Despite the balance update improvements, these guys have still not really been played in competitive lists at all. They still have the issue where their damage output just isn't really all that general purpose and still not even that good for the points given that they went up in points at the same time, and even their durability per point isn't quite as excessive as it used to be given that they had the same profile at 95 points before. There's still a lot of stats and can be a lot to handle in more casual games. They might enjoy the Anvil Siege Force as well with the +1 to wound if they can remain static. Unfortunately, they still fall into a role where they're going to have a lot of competition for their battlefield role, particularly not really having a particular special rule for objectives and things, and lots of other Space Marine units are good competition, perhaps in particular regular intercessor squads. Lastly, for the main Space Marine battle line choices, we've got the Tactical Squad. They're 140 points for 10 models worth of firstborn troops, and really quite cheap to put their standard Space Marine stat line on the board. Their draws to the unit are that you get a fancy sergeant weapon, a las cannon or multi-melter, and then a special weapon per 10. And then you can split the squad in two, so you can have a squad of 5 grunts to hold the home field, when all the things with the exciting, dangerous weapons can push forward, maybe in a rhino or something if you're feeling generous. Unfortunately, really being cheap and having a hidden las cannon is really one of the only things they've got going for them. It just feels that most of the time you'd be better off in spending a few more points and say getting something a bit more dedicated with either heavy firepower or special rules like infiltrators to hold the backfield, and then taking one of the other units that can venture forward with some more focused damage profiles. I've given them a 5 out of 10 here, they're not unusable. Finally, for the core Space Marines, I've also mentioned the Outrider squad as well, given their battle line in company of hunters. They're really quite chunky bikers with 3 models for 80 points and 4 wounds at toughness 5 for that, so take a lot of shooting given that they're quite fast. They're generally best at killing light infantry, though can threaten marines at least with their thunderous impact, with +1 to their strength and damage characteristics, which can also confer to attached characters. I'm only rating them here for Company of Hunters, so that's the Dark Angels detachment that gives them a whole bunch of other Mounted and Ravenwing related bonuses. I feel like they could be an interesting enough attachment option for, say, Samael, for example, giving him their +1 strength and damage on the charge. Overall, I've given them an 8 out of 10 here, given that you're going to be playing around them if you're running that detachment, though not really that many Dark Angels players are using it. It seems more people tend to use Stormlance, if anything. Next up, for the Adepta Sororitas, we've got the Battle Sister squad. They're 100 points for their regular 1 wound power armoured troops with a 3+ save, OC2 again, and a slightly rarely used 6+ invulnerable save. In their unit, they're often fielded decked out with melter weapons, a multi-melter, regular melter gun, an inferno pistol, plus maybe a power weapon on the Sister Superior. And like the intercessors, they come with the sticky objectives rule. The ability to farm miracle dice with the Simulacrum Imperialis, and the chance to regain a miracle dice with Acts of Faith once per game with their Cherub. Sisters are certainly having a tough time of it right now, but the Battle Sister squad are rated as one of their stronger units, often fielded with an Immolator, so you can split the squad in two. You could have one unit with the Simulacrum farm miracle dice on the home objective, and then push the other squad up the board with the melter gun and multi-melter, and maybe use their free Act of Faith to do some big damage with that once they jump out. Between all that, I've given them an 8 out of 10. I feel like they're often a unit that you'd really want in the army list. Before we move on to the other Imperial faction troops, I'd just like to give a shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA and have made some fancy dice with the Auspex Tactics logo on for some channel merch, and at the time they asked to sponsor a bunch of videos on the channel. They've got a particularly huge range of dice, many of which could tie in well with certain themes and tropes found in all manner of miniature armies out there. There's a bunch that fit in well with chapters and different armies. They're big chunky dice, and the focus is more on quality rather than quantity. You get 25 of them for $32 or £26 with the code Auspex to get 5% off for any order through them. They've got loads of designs to check out, so feel free to take a look at them. Links down in the video description. Everything from mechanical cog dice to Templar themed ones and fleur-de-lis ones for all your warrior nun needs. And if you did want to pick up some of the channel dice as well, here are the Auspex Tactics ones, and they're linked down in the video description. All of these ship out from the USA, so they're a bit cheaper there versus having to pay international overseas shipping. As always though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video, and you can find them links down in the video description below. Back to the various 40k troops choices though, and next up we have the Astra Militarum, with their 3 flavours of regiment themed infantry units now. In general they're toughness 3 with 1 wound and a 5+ save, or with OC2, that could potentially be more if they have a command squad with a regimental banner in it. They attack with las guns for the majority of the units, with a couple of special weapons mixed in, and you can either have 10 in a squad for a small investment unit, or a big 20 for a big block to stack orders and damage combos on. The Cadian shock troops specifically get the sticky objectives type rule once again, so again can be kind of handy just to have one unit in the army at least, and they can be an interesting choice for having the option to attach Ursula Creed to. It's really quite an efficient force multiplier with her orders and her free stratagem, and as with the rest of the infantry squads, you can make some interesting combos with 2 different leader units attached to them. It means that you can have 25 models with a command squad, and even another attached character if that makes sense, all trocking out into the midfield. They do have quite a lot of synergies from their various detachments as well. Lots of the newer ones are fairly infantry focused, particularly things like the Recon Element and Siege Regiment. Overall I've chosen to give them a 7 out of 10. Definitely lots of bodies with high objective control, and can punch a little bit harder with their special weapons, though I feel like they did take a blow when they can't get the 6+ feel no pain from the command squad anymore. That was quite nice to add a little bit of extra stats durability. Next up, and as alternatives to them, we've got the Death Corps of Krieg. They're 65 points or 130. Generally they're a similar sort of deal, but trade the sticky objectives for damage dealing. Due to their dour and sacrifice happy nature, they get more dangerous as they take damage, with a +1 to hit if they've lost models and a +1 to wound if they're below half strength. That can make them quite nice if you actually want guard infantry to be used as damage dealers in the midfield. They also come with the med pack built into the unit, so that's D3 models restored to the squad if you've got 1, or D3+1 if you have 2. Overall, I feel like besides character attachment options and sticky objective type things, they're probably the better choice for venturing into the midboard to fight with the enemy if you want to deal damage. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. Finally, for the guard troops choices, we've got the Kazachan Jungle Fighters, 65 points for 10 models, and these guys have a few fewer options due to their more simplistic kit. Instead of the more punchy special weapons, these guys get flamers, but they're still not awful for skirmishing with light infantry. They're jungle fighters for the +1 to wound in melee on the first turn of close combat, and perhaps most importantly, they get the scout special rule, so moving 6 inches into the midboard to get all that objective control onto the midboard objectives nice and early. As a result, they've often been a staple in guard lists, ready to take up positions and be a fairly cheap sacrificial unit, either on foot or in transport vehicles. Overall, I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. I feel like they're rarely going to be an awful choice in a guard army. Though at 65 points, they're not quite as very cheap disposable infantry as they used to be when they were, say, 55. Finally, for the guard, we've got the Tempestus Scions, who can be battle line in the Bridgehead Strike. They're 65 points for 5 of them now, and 130 per 10. 4+ safeguard stormtroopers who can indeed deep strike despite the codex saying otherwise, and they fight with their hotshot las weapons with an extra AP -1 versus the normal variety, +2 special weapons per squad of 5, perhaps a plasma and melter gun, or maybe swapping out one of those for a hotshot volley gun if you'd want. The Tempestor also gets a power fist. These guard elite stormtroopers drop in from the sky, and their Scholar Progenium training gives them reroll 1s to wound, so a bit more damage there, going up to rerolling all wound rolls against things on objectives, which can lead to some pretty punchy firepower. In general, these guys are just pretty efficient full stop. Cheapish units to drop in and do secondaries are nice enough just for 65 points in their own. You can have big damage combos dropping in any detachment with a Militarum Tempestus command squad and then 10 of these guys. The special weapon fire of those is really fearsome, or having say 5 of them and a command squad jumping out of a Taurox Prime that can give them 4 hit rerolls. In Bridgehead Strike though, they're thoroughly next level, taking great advantage of a whole bunch of boosted stratagems for them, including return to reserves, plus they like the +1 to wound detachment rule too. Overall in Bridgehead Strike I'll give them a 9.5 out of 10, an already good unit with some massive buffing rules here. If you're playing this attachment, then you are going to take a lot of them, and they're one of the battle line troops choices that you could easily spam more than 3. Next up, for the Adeptus Mechanicus, we've got the Skitarii troops choices, and in AdMech they're perhaps weirdly vital given that they give buffing rules to a bunch of things around them. Maybe the Catastrophe Breaches being one of the most notable ones given that they can full reroll hit rolls, taking them from being kind of okay damage outputs to genuinely murderous. Both flavours of Skitarii troops are 4+ save units with 1 wound and OC2, come with a whole bunch of fun special weapons with the Plasma Caliber, Galvanic Rifle and the Arquebus, and ignores cover and a data tether to potentially farm CP. The Rangers specifically come equipped with galvanic rifles, so fairly long range volume fire there, and they get the Scouts keyword, so move into the midboard, maybe in a Dune Rider transport if they want to, and they have the objective secured special rule, again so sticky objectives, so quite nice to be able to mark a home objective with that, or if you can get it to work in the midfield then that's pretty nice too. Both these and the Vanguard are kind of extra stand out in the popular Skitarii Hunter cohort detachment as well, which tends to be one of the better ways to play AdMech, and have a few nice synergies there, escorting these Skitarii Marshals around, who can make their damage outputs really quite nice when jumping out of a Dune Rider, and might be able to do some other cool things like move, shoot, move, or messing around with the Doctrina Imperatives. Overall I feel like they're maybe a slightly hard unit to rate, their base stats aren't absolutely enormous, but at the same time, due to supporting the army so well and also being pretty nice in one of the most competitive detachments, they do almost always tend to get a fair bit of play. I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10 overall. Otherwise, it's maybe not so very different for the Skitarii Vanguard. They cost more than the Rangers now, 95 points versus 85. The guys who aren't taking the fancy upgrades or alpha weapons, they instead get mass volume fire with their radium carbines with anti-infantry 4+, and their special rules instead to reduce the objective control of units on mid-board objectives, so typically they tend to be a bit better suited for skirmishing for the midfield, and you might have problems taking points against them if any of them do manage to survive. I'd say they're pretty well balanced versus the Rangers, and I'd score them an 8 out of 10. Again, not damage output that's going to change the world, but can be nice enough when buffed. A nice supporting rule, and they're both sometimes surprisingly tanky with their 5+ invulnerable saves when you make a few of them in a row. Next up, for the Adeptus Custodes, we've got the Custodian Guard. They're 45 points per model, and you can take either 4 or 5 of them. A great big chunky troops choice where even the least of the Custodes is a massive force to be reckoned with a stat line that's not so far from other factions' characters. They're toughness 6 with a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable, and 3 wounds. They come with OC2 or OC3 if you have a Vexilla, which often people take alongside the Presidium Shield. And typically they're fielded with Guardian Spears for the rest of them, a bit of volume shooting with Strength 4 and Damage 2, and a bunch of Strength 7 and Damage 2 attacks in melee. This is very general purpose when combined with shield host buffs or lethal hits from the Martial Qatar. Their special rules are a damage buff rule, rerolling wound rolls of 1, or all wound rerolls if they're in control of an objective. That can be massive if they can charge in and take a point while they're fighting with the enemy, and once per game they can double up on their shooting attacks, so actually have a surprising amount of damage to volume fire from those Guardian Spears, and that can also be particularly nasty when applied to Kyria Draxus as well, an Inquisitor who's often seen joining them between preventing them from being shot at long range and her own surprisingly nasty shooting profiles. In general, maybe the Wardens tend to be more commonly used as the actual battle line of the Custodian Guard though. They're just really quite nice with still good damage output but massive durability, and more people tend to play them en masse. I feel like I often just see one unit of Custodian Guard with Draxus in army lists. In any case, still very strong, and I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Otherwise for the Custodes, they can field Prosecutors as battle line in Normaid and Vigil. 40 points for a unit of 4 of them, going up to 100 points for a unit of 10. They have similar sort of stat lines to the Sisters of Battle with their OC2 and 1 wound with a 3+ save, and have basic bolt guns when shooting, which get precision and devastating wounds when they're targeting Psychers. In general, the reason that you take these tends to be for cheap units to do actions and secondaries, and it often makes sense to either have some of these along or some Witch Seekers, so big expensive Custodian units don't wind up doing grunt work. I feel like they're not exactly the most focal unit in Normaid and Vigil though. If you're going to try and make these Sisters work as more damage dealer style things, it's either going to be the Flamers or the Great Blades. Overall, I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 though. Something like 1 to 3 units I never think is really a particularly bad choice given how cheap they are. For the Grey Knights, we've got the Strike Squad. They're 120 points per 5 or 240 per 10. Grey Knight Space Marines being able to deep strike in, and these guys can also scout as well if it makes sense to, and they get the improved armor save of a 2+ with that true silver armor. At range they can attack with a bunch of Storm Bolters, sometimes one might take an Incinerator, though you do have to lose their melee weapon to do that. Their close combat is fairly punchy, 3 attacks each at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2, going to mess up a bunch of standard Space Marines really quite well. Again, they're one of the troops choices that has the sticky objectives kind of rule, and as a result you often see maybe just one unit of these in a Grey Knight army, maybe putting that rule on the home objectives and then teleporting elsewhere to maybe plonk it down on the mid-board later. Overall, solid enough for that role, though they don't really generally tend to get built around hugely. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here, maybe just some slightly diminishing returns after one unit. Next up, we've got the Brotherhood Terminator Squad. Like the Custodian, is an intimidating profile to have on a battle line choice. Standard Terminator stat lines with toughness 5, a 2+ save, 3 wounds, and a 4+ invulnerable. They're 200 points per 5 of them, and that's how I'd take them now that the bigger squad got more expensive than the smaller. They can have an Incinerator in the unit, they get a banner that gives them +1 objective control, and a Narthesium for the Terminator Apothecary to heal a unit in the squad each turn, meaning that they can bounce back a bit even if they take casualties. They get 4 attacks with their Nemesis Force weapons, and they get the lethal hits on the charge, which makes them a lot more relevant against tough stuff than some of their peers. And in particular, they tend to be very, very nice indeed with Caldor Drago himself. He can deliver them into combat from deep strike really quite reliably, has a nice profile that can help them with tough stuff, and both he and them will enjoy the lethal hits when they do happen to be charging against monsters and vehicles. Overall solid units to build around for the Grey Knights. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. They can also use their redeployment style stratagems rather well. There'd also be ones that enjoy the full hit rerolls when they can get them in the more recent Soulfire detachment. For the Imperial Knights, their armigers are their battle line troops, sturdy vehicles even for the lowest of the knights, toughness 10 with 12 wounds and a 5+ invulnerable save from their ion shields against range. They move very fast with a 12-inch move and have OC8, so quite a big presence on objectives. They often tend to be a good idea to be scrapping over the mid-board objectives, being a bit more sacrificial than the big knights out there. For the variants, the Armiger Helverin gets 8 shots at Strength 9, AP 1, Damage 3, and Anti-Fly 2+ if they're either in your deployment zone or on an objective marker. A lot better against certain things than others, but hopefully should stack at least a few saves. They do quite enjoy the Focus Fire Armiger stratagem, getting a little bit more AP and maybe a touch more strength. I was kind of surprised when they went down to 130 points. They're just quite efficient units now, with nice fire support that works really well against certain targets like say Catan, and most Knight Army lists include Armigers in good numbers. Their melee counterpart are the Armiger Warglaves, 140 points for their profile, and their really nasty damage output with their Thermal Spear, which is a big 2 shots at Strength 12, AP 4 and Damage D6, and then a very frightening Melter 4 within 12-inch range, maybe backed up by a Melter Gun or Stubber. In melee, they don't have standout melee stats, but are just fairly effective against everything. 4 attacks with Strength 10, AP 3 and Damage 3, which will enjoy the single nightly rerolls in a similar sort of way to the Thermal Spear or a Sweep mode. When they charge in, they get Sustained Hits 1 as well, which definitely doesn't hurt either. These are exactly the sort of unit that you want to have skirmishing on the mid-board objectives, moving up and forcing the opponents to try and trade something out for them, but still having to commit something at least fairly punchy, as they're relatively tough with their profile and the 6+ feel no pain. Overall, they're just very efficient units and hard to go wrong with. I've given them a 9.5 out of 10 here. Finally, for the Armigers, there's also the Forge World Armiger Moirax. This one's 160 points and has the similar sort of stat line. They've got all manner of different Forge World gun profiles, a few having a bit more anti-horde, or some fun things like Rag Cleansers paired with a big hitting Siege Claw. Their special rule isn't the most overwhelming though, with 3 Heroic Intervention. Unfortunately, at 160 points, they are just significantly behind the other Armigers out there, and I've given them a 5 out of 10 here. For the Imperial Agents, we've got the Navy Breachers at 90 points. Their sort of Stormtrooper style profile with Toughness 3 and a 4+ save and OC2. They get one of the damage rules against objectives, rerolling wound rolls of 1 or rerolling all wound rolls if they target something on an objective marker. Their main weapons get them a whole bunch of Navis shotguns, some spam strength 4 damage with a little bit of special weapons mixed in, plus a couple of power weapons, and have a few fun supporting rules such as a once per game ignores cover and a Geist Skull for a long range grenade attack when they need it. For the Imperial Agents, they tend to be at least a fairly focal unit, having the option to deep strike them and things in the Imperialis fleet detachment, or even infiltrate them alongside a rogue trader entourage. They are an important unit and one that's sort of necessary to build around for the Agents, but still for the points cost neither their damage nor defense is particularly outstanding, which isn't really the best given that the Imperial Agents don't really have things that take down tough stuff either. Overall, I'd give them a 6.5 out of 10, likely to be one of the units of choice in more competitive Agents lists, but that's maybe not really saying all that much right now. Otherwise, for the Imperial Agents, we've also got the RBT's Vigilant Squad. These ones are a kind of similar deal with OC2, a 4+ save and shotguns. Their special rule is a bit worse though, only triggering against things that are below half strength. Otherwise, again, they can take some special weapons or heavy weapons like a big shotgun, a stubber or a Weber. They get a Cyber Mastiff that can do a few attacks in close combat, and a Nuncio Aquila which could occasionally cheat the enemy out of a few victory points. Unfortunately, I just don't really see them competing very much against the Subductors if you are putting RBTs in the list. I feel like they've got a lot fewer synergies versus the Navy Breachers. Between those, I've given them a 5 out of 10, a little bit on the weak side even for Imperial Agents. Lastly, for the Agents, we've got their version of the Deathwatch kill team. Standard Deathwatch Xenos hunting veterans with a whole host of special gear to be able to take down their specialised targets. They've got a 3+ save and 2 wounds with OC2 here. Their best bet is likely to be a mixed shooting and melee unit, getting an Infernus Heavy Bolter, Frag Cannon, and then a pair of those very hard-hitting Heavy Thunderhammers with Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 3. They get to reroll some hit rolls, and then that going up to full hit rerolls if they target things that are Xenos. Overall, I would say they're one of the more important agents of the Imperium units, just because they're one of the very few things that can actually leave a mark on enemy tough stuff. But still, compared with the Deathwatch Index and the options that has, now it's returned to the fold, they just have far fewer synergy options, and no one's really playing Deathwatch with the Auto Xenos detachment these days versus their new Index. As a result, I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 here, one of the more important units for Agents, though not doing enough to be able to actually make the overall army work so far. Finally, we're back to a few more Space Marines as well, with the Divergent chapter troops choices. First up, the Blood Claws for the Space Wolves, a horde-style unit of ferocious young Space Wolf new inductees. They're 140 points for 10 or 210 for 15, hitting with a fairly huge volume of Astartes chainsaw attacks with a power fist or two hidden in. When they charge, they get +1 to their attacks and +1 to their strength, making them genuinely quite fearsome out of a Rhino. I feel like they pair quite well with Ulrich the Slayer as well, with his big rerolls, which can make them into a surprisingly cheap and effective general purpose damage dealer that's also fairly tough and fairly high on OC. They still don't really seem to get taken all that much in Space Wolf army lists despite that, but I feel like they're solid enough. I'd give them a 7 out of 10. Otherwise, there's the Grey Hunters for 85 points. They can have the best of both worlds, a few Space Marine units, with the option to take both bolters and chainswords, plus 2 special weapons in a unit of 5 of them, an extra plasma pistol and a power fist, so really quite a lot of loaded up special weapons there, and they can also shoot in a turn when they fell back or advanced. Space Marines do have a massive amount of competitors for the sort of 85 point objective skirmisher kind of role though, and that might make them just a little bit hard to compete with the rest. They do have more damage than most units out there, but also no objective supporting special rule, which likely means that all manner of different units are probably going to get the nod over them. For what they are though, I really don't feel like they're all that far behind. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here as well. For a cheap investment unit, they can do a good job of mauling their peers between special weapon fire and then a follow-up charge with power fist and chainswords. Next up for the Black Templars, we've got the Primaris Crusader squad, 150 points per 10 or 320 for a squad of 20, paying a premium for any big synergies they can get. They have a mix of the Initiates and the Neophytes, with the Chapter inductees training up their squires and the next generation in glorious close combat, and typically tend to get fielded with mass chainswords and combat knives, usually with a few power fists thrown in for good measure. They can scout 6 inches as well if they don't have a character attached, and can reroll advance and charge rolls. The Crusader squad are one of the more important units for Black Templars, and can be used for a few big synergies such as say 10 Houses Bones for the 5+ Feel No Pain, or being a good choice for leader units like Grimaldus. They did get a slightly brutal points nerf in the not too distant past though, which really took the edge off them, and now tend to be a bit more of a luxury pick as a result. They're still pretty playable, though I feel like you really do need to get the maximum amount out of their big synergies now though. I've given them a 7 out of 10. For their firstborn equivalents, they're still around at least until the Black Templar Codex comes out. They're between 85 and 290 points, depending on exactly what mix of Space Marines you take. They're basically like a cheap and cheerful tactical squad. You can have a las cannon or multi-melter in the unit alongside a power fist. They can't scout, but they can also reroll advance and charge rolls. Having a cheap squad with a punchy las cannon isn't the worst in the world really. Could be nice enough if you're doing say Ironstorm things with the Black Templars. In general though, they still tend to be a little bit more rarely taken. I've given them a 6 out of 10. Their main draw when they were often played tended to be just that they were ridiculously cheap for the amount of wounds and the damage that you got, but that's not really the case anymore. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Deathwatch veterans, 100 points per 5 of them and 200 per 10. Basically the same deal as the Codex Imperial Agents version, big hitting frag cannons and Inferno heavy bolters, plus massively punchy thunder hammers with strength 10 and damage 3. In their own index though, they've got so much more going on. They'll get mission tactics for their various turns of damage boosts, and better options for transports and character attachments, plus Oath of Moment. And they're not the only unit that's trying to carry an army. They've got lots of other kill teams to back them up, never mind the rest of the things that you can take from Codex Space Marines. These guys were recently used to win the massive Las Vegas Open tournament in the recent past as well. 20 got used there, 2 sets of 5 and 1 set of 10, running up in rhinos, one with a Watchmaster and one with a Judiceer with the Thief of Secrets. The smaller investment units can be kind of helpful for Deathwatch as well, particularly with the kill team keywords to use their stratagems, and mean that you don't have to commit a great big 10-man squad to literally every single fight. Overall, it certainly seems that they're being solid and scary enough at the moment. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Moving on to the battle lines of Chaos now, and first up we have the Legionaries, 90 points per 5 of them or 170 per 10, a little bit cheaper for the big size units. They get the standard Space Marine stat line with a 3+ save and OC2, and can have a bunch of fun things in the unit, getting a couple of heavy melee weapons in a squad of 5 of them, plus either a special or heavy along for the ride, all buffed by the scary Dark Pacts, having the option to take a few mortal wounds in service of the Dark Gods. They're being rewarded with either sustained hits or lethal hits depending on what your target wants. Typically they'll often have a bunch of chainsaws to back them up, and perhaps be running alongside a Chaos Lord or Master of Executions or both, where they can potentially give them the big wound rerolls that they have, rerolling wound rolls of 1 or all wound rerolls against things on objectives. In general, they've been really quite powerful in a good number of Chaos detachments, often jumping out of rhinos. Just with the big hitting damage output of the Chaos Lord, that's usually enough to justify them, but various different detachments can give them a lot of good stuff, everything from new creations of bile to Renegade Raiders, really making them extra savage against objectives, or Pact-bound Zealots with their boosted Dark Pacts. Overall very easy to include in a Chaos Space Marine army. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Otherwise, for the standard Chaos Marines, we've got Cultists, 50 points per 10 of them, and cheap expendable grunts to die for the Dark Gods. They're toughness 3 with 1 wound and a 6+ save, so basically it can just be a bunch of objective control on points, do actions and secondaries when needed, and they get the sticky objectives rule, which is really quite nice to be able to access just for 50 points in an army list. It means that a whole load of chaos lists often take at least some. They're not generally going to do all that much damage in melee, but if a tiny bit is absolutely critical, they can be made a bit better with their Dark Pacts. Lethal hits with their melee attacks means at least a few enemies are likely to take saves. For being so cheap and getting that secondary rule, I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Finally, for core Chaos Marines, we've got the Traitor Guardsmen, which can be battle line in the Chaos Cults. They're pretty equivalent to the regular Guardsman squad, OC2 and a 5+ save, so a bit raised from Cultist there. They get some special weapons for a little bit more punch versus tough stuff, still get the Dark Pacts to make them a tiny bit more scary, and their Twisted Defense Force rule means that they get cover while they're on objectives. At 70 points I'd rate them as really quite bad for the majority of Chaos lists unfortunately, but if they're in Chaos Cult I'd give them a higher ranking. They are one of the many units that can do multiple small unit things in that army, and their special weapons can actually punch a little bit harder than normal, and you can have multiple waves of traitors moving in to grab objectives. I still don't think that they're the focal unit of the detachment compared with, say, the Accursed Cultists, but I'll give them a 7 out of 10 there, as they're quite usable in that one. Moving on, we've got the Cult Marines, and the Death Guard have the Plague Marines, 90 points for 5 or 180 per 10. Plague Marines are the unit with all sorts of weird and wonderful gear, and you can basically equip the entire squad as specialists pretty much, mixing things like standard special weapons, a few heavy plague weapons, and maybe some bubotic weapons thrown in for a bit more punch in close combat. They generally tend to be really quite successful run up in Rhinos, and maybe joined by some combination of either a Foul Blight spawn or Biologist Putrefier or both, handing out things like fights first or extra critical hits, and such a unit can be a massive damage threat to most things in the game, particularly with extra AP boosts from their contagions. Overall they're strong enough for a whole bunch of Death Guard armies to include a unit like that in game, and I've given them an 8 out of 10 overall. For the Thousand Suns, we've got the Dusty Automata that are the Rubric Marines, 110 points per 5 of them and 200 points per 10, which seems to be at least quite well balanced, maybe giving it a bit more draw to the damage dealer version of the squad with 10 of them than there would be otherwise. They get an Inspiring Sorcerer with some psychic shooting and a Warp Flame pistol. The rest of the squad generally takes the Warp Flamers, maybe one with a Soul Reaper cannon. That's quite nice with some spammed Strength 6 devastating wound fire. They come with a 5+ invulnerable save, the chance to get critical hits on 6s improve the AP. They generate a Cabal point, and they get some big rerolls against things on objective markers, which can combo incredibly nastily with Infernal Masters. With his psychic shooting attack, he can put some absolutely deadly firepower onto the mid-board. Given that they're basically the bodyguard unit for the important sorcerers in the army, they almost always tend to get included in fairly good numbers, maybe something like 3 squads of 5, perhaps a bit more. A nice combination of generating Cabal points, some massive damage in the midfield, and big Overwatch threat as well with all of those torrent attacks. Overall I've given them an 8 out of 10. All very powerful troops of Tzeentch, but charged at a bit of a big points premium after Games Workshop repeatedly put them up. Otherwise for the Thousand Suns they also have the Zangors, 65 points for 10 Goat Birdmen, putting out mass attacks that can handle light infantry in close combat, and at least being maybe a little bit sturdier versus Cultists with a toughness 4 and a 6+ invulnerable. They've got the potential to generate an extra command point if they're standing on objectives, and have OC2, which is a small advantage versus Cultist, but in general don't really seem to be very favoured versus the other different types of Thousand Suns chaff. People quite like the scout moving Cultists that also get the 6+ invulnerable save, plus smaller units of Enlightened that move quickly. Overall I've given them a 6 out of 10. I haven't really seen too many people make use of them in competitive lists, though they're really not that far behind the other variants of chaff I think. For the Disciples of the Blood God, we've got the Khorne Berserkers, 90 points per 5 and 180 per 10. Twisted Chaos Marines driven mad by the Butcher's Nails. Again, they've got the fairly standard Space Marine stat line with 2 wounds, a 3+ save and OC2. And they'll just hand out masses and masses of damage 1 attacks, usually at strength 6 and 5 attacks each on the charge in the more core detachment. Plus also get an Eviscerator or 2 for a little bit more punch against tough stuff. They get a Cornate Icon, which can allow you to re-roll some Blessings dice on objectives, which doesn't hurt too much if they're scrapping for the mid-board, and they also have a rather nasty Blood Surge rule, which means that if they're shot, they might be able to pile into combat with you, and that can make them really quite problematic to deal with on mid-board objectives, perhaps particularly with a Master of Executions along for the ride, giving them a nasty fights first. In general, they tend to be at least fairly widely played in competitive World Eaters armies, maybe not necessarily absolutely mandatory though, usually included in a Rhino alongside a character. I actually feel like out of the points of that equation, it feels like they just charge quite a lot for the character models that lead them, and you kind of want one of those to give them a bit more bite against tougher stuff. Overall scary enough and can still do masses of damage when amped up by blessings or stratagems. I've given them an 8 out of 10. For their cultist thralls in the Jackals, they're the cultists that have the tanks of World Eater blood to power them up, giving them a whole load of Cornate Frenzy at the cost of a shortened lifespan. They get a whole bunch of sustained hits melee that gets way better when they charge in. They should be able to blend enemy chaff units really quite well, and actually perhaps have a surprising amount of damage when you get all of them to fight for 65 points. They're not super tough, but do get a 6+ feel no pain. They get the sticky objectives type rule, which can be really quite nice, along with them maybe being scouted into the midboard by Lord Invocatus, and also with the option to be able to get sticky objectives when a unit dies as well. If one gets shot down, they're going to be able to hold that point against shooting almost regardless of whether or not they're killed. They also get another Blessings reroll like the Berserkers, which can be handy enough for the backfield. These guys are pretty handy to have around, I think. Cheap and low investment World Eaters units, nice enough for doing actions and still having a good amount of objective control between a unit of 10 of them, and also with enough damage to genuinely threaten enemy lighter infantry units if they need to. I've given them an 8 out of 10 as well, all very appropriate for Khorne there, I suppose. For the Emperor's Children, things are going to change a lot for them kind of soon, but at the moment it's the Noise Marines that are the battle line when Lucius is the Warlord. That's going to change to the Infractors and the Tormentors though, with the Noise Marines bringing the Sonic as more like Havoc equivalents. For the moment though, they're kind of like an upgone Legionary squad. They can take most of the standard Legionary kits, but instead for their special weapons they get Sonic Blasters, which the entire squad can take, a bunch of spammed Strength 5 shooting, with maybe the biggest most standout thing being the Blastmaster, either 3 big hits at Strength 9, AP 2 and Damage 3, or swapping out for a bunch of Damage 1 attacks. At 85 points they really can be quite a small general purpose and fairly scary unit. A fairly good amount of shooting, particularly with the Blastmaster, getting a Power Fist in close combat, and the ability to take Dark Pacts, and the Chaos Icon can make them a little bit more reliable. I'd say perhaps their main disadvantage is the way that Emperor's Children work at the moment, meaning that you kind of have to commit to them, though they have been good enough to win major tournaments in the past. I've given the Noise Marines a 7.5 out of 10. I'd probably say that or higher overall, but in any case things are changing big for the Emperor's Children soon. Next up we have the Chaos Knights and their Wardog vassals, doing much the same as the Imperial Knights, the smallest class of knights with toughness 10, 12 wounds and a 5+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks, moving fast with a bunch of OC. In general, Wardogs do tend to be the strongest Chaos Knights right now, and Games Workshop really doesn't seem to have done very well to balance them. Running through the variants, the Wardog Executioner is cheap now at 130 points. I still probably rate it below the Brigand for sheer firepower though. The special rule isn't quite as good as the Loyalist one, lacking the anti-fly, and they also don't get the rerolls that the Loyalist does either. For the ranged Wardogs, it still seems that people are very much on the Brigand train. 165 points for a Wardog that hits on a 2+ with a Demon Breath Spear and the Chain Cannon. It means that they're just very scary little general purpose gun turrets that can be a big threat to both monsters and to lighter infantry. And they get quite a nice buff for extra AP against things up close. Not uncommon to see loads of these in an army list. I've given them a 9 out of 10 overall. Otherwise, we've got the Wardog Huntsman. This is basically the Armature Warglaive equivalent with the big hitting Demon Breath Spear and the Reaper Chain Talon. Their special rule is a buff against monsters and vehicles, which does make them at least a fair bit more solid against them, re-rolling wound rolls and damage rolls of 1. I've given them an 8 out of 10, and they still tend to get played a fair bit less than the Stalker. Speaking of which, the Stalker also dropped down recently. He is now 140 points, and he tends to be the more commonly taken of the two over the Huntsman, often using the Slaughter Claw for that very scary damage d6 plus 2 attacks, though maybe more commonly still using the Demon Breath Spear, though you could take the Chain Cannon if you felt like you needed more anti-infantry. The special rule on this guy is pretty nasty, with +1 to wounds against enemy units that are isolated, and plus it also has the character keyword as well as being a battle line, which is kind of unusual. So you could give it enhancements like handing out battle shock and things if you wanted, and it could use Epic Challenge to kill some characters too. Overall a really solid datasheet still. I've given him an 8.5 out of 10. The Carnivore is the brutal melee Wardog with the Chain Talon and the Slaughter Claw, and he can choose the right profile for the right attacks, with loads of things hitting on 2s. He hits at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2. He masks out as just on the base stats one of the very most efficient units in the game at killing monsters and vehicles, and no slouch against a bunch of other stuff either. Really hard to go too far wrong with these. They move a massive 14 inches, and in the core Chaos Knight detachment can be made to walk through walls for massive threat range. Exactly the sort of cheap and expendable but also incredibly dangerous knight to have in the front ranks, and they often get spammed. I've given them a 9.5 out of 10. Finally for Knights we also have the Chaos version of the Moirax as well. He's 160 points and if anything a bit weaker than the Loyalist version. Again, not really unusable, but just massively eclipsed by the other ones. You've got way better Knights that have both a melee weapon and a bunch of anti-infantry style fire, given the Loyalists don't have access to the Avenger chain cannon to hand out some anti-horde. Particularly in the context of the War Dogs going down again, he feels like he's fallen even further behind. Overall, I've given him a 4 out of 10. Finally, for the Disciples of the Chaos Gods, we've got their actual physical manifestations in the Demons. First up, Bloodletters are 110 points, Savage Demons of Khorns with their Hellblades, Toughness 4 with a 5+ invulnerable save to protect them, a big OC 2, and when they hit in close combat they strike with Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2, enable 2 reroll wound rolls of 1 built in. They're generally one of the easier and scarier units to be able to deliver from Deep Strike, dropping in at a 6-inch charge, potentially just for 1 command point with a stratagem now. Otherwise maybe latching on to Be'lakor or Bloodthirster's Shadow of Chaos. They'll even be charging at a 5 inches most of the time given their Instrument of Chaos, and are pretty great just to drop in and clear out a whole bunch of elite infantry, even if they are fairly fragile on the strike back for 11 points per model. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10, and they can get more dangerous from a bunch of debuffs from the different demons as well. Next up there's the Pink Horrors for 140 points. These Tzeentchian warp fire casting demons started a unit of 10 pink horrors but split into smaller blue and then brimstone horrors on a 4+ when they get shot, basically meaning that they're an unusually irritating unit to remove from objectives, potentially even winding up with more models in the squad after you've shot down the first few of them. Durability really feels like their standout thing, as their damage output isn't really all that great, just 2 attacks hitting on a 4, strength 4 and AP 1, and the ways to buff them in the codex don't really get them to be particularly meaningful. Definitely could be an interesting choice if you just want a bunch of chaff to put on an objective, though it seems that more people tend to use Plague Bearers for that if you just want something sturdy with OC. Still very usable though, I'd rate them a 7 out of 10. For the Blue Horrors, they're basically 125 points for a unit with Infiltrate, paying quite a big premium for that I think, and they're not really very good in terms of damage or defense at all. They still can split into Brimstone Horrors, so you might get 15 wounds out of the unit, and they might be at least fairly annoying to remove given that they've still got the 4+ invulnerable save, but far less so than the Pinks given the amount of points they cost. In general I'd be a bit more enthused about them if Nurglings weren't a thing, but given that they're usually an option, then that usually tends to be the best way to put some infiltrating units on the board if you want to. Super expendable for 40 points rather than having to pay a rather massive 125 points. I feel like that's worth it for the loss of the OC and the ability to score primary objectives or do certain action related secondaries. I think you're best off having the Nurglings to screen and then have other things move up behind swiftly, as opposed to invest in the front line with these guys most of the time. Again, still not unusable though for an infiltrate unit that's paying a premium for some OC. I've given them a 5.5 out of 10 here. For the chunky battle line demons of Nurgle, we've got the Plague Bearers. These guys are 110 points, and for the 11 points per model they're really quite sturdy. Toughness 5 with 2 wounds and a 5+ invulnerable save. Just about everything will chip away at them, but whatever it is going to take a fair bit of volume fire. Their damage output maybe isn't the main point for them, but they can still make a mess of light infantry with lethal hits Plague Swords with AP -1. It means that if the opponent charges into them and doesn't clear them, they are probably going to be taking a bit of chip damage, and they could bully some lighter infantry squads themselves. They get one of these sticky objectives type rules, which can often make them into a good unit to ally for Knights as well. And it's fairly common to see one unit in a list between their objective grabbing skills and that. Overall I've given them an 8 out of 10, not really going to do much damage, but if you want to just hold a primary for a turn and make the opponent actually have to commit some force to it, then these guys could do that. For their diminutive minions, we've got the Nurglings, swarms of mischievous demons spreading poxes far and wide, 40 points for 3 of them, and then 70 or 105 points for 6 and 9. For their points cost, they're still genuinely okay on the defensive profile, only toughness 3 with a 6+ invulnerable save, but 4 wounds apiece, which means that you get really quite a lot of wounds per point, more than most else in 40k. They won't do too much in melee, but can do just a tiny bit in terms of lethal hits, and perhaps more importantly debuff enemies within 6 inches of them, so they're -1 to hit as well, and that makes them quite nice to have in the front ranks. Mainly their biggest value though is that they're a very cheap unit that can infiltrate, hold down the mid-board and screen out the enemy trying to advance, and when they do so, if they move close to these and can't deal with them, they'll be -1 to hit, which is helpful enough as well, and they can still do some certain positional secondaries even without any objective control. As it is, lots of lists choose to ally them in, and they're fairly easy to include for Chaos Demons in small numbers. For their cheap utility role, I've given them a 9 out of 10. Finally for the demons, we've got the Demonettes of Slaanesh, very fast moving with 9 inches. but really quite fragile as well. Toughness 3 with a 5+ invulnerable save means that small arms will clear them quickly. They attack with a flurry of strength 4 and AP 1 damage 1 attacks, all with devastating wounds, so good at clearing light infantry but will still have some effect against everything else. They reroll hit rolls of 1 against everything, and reroll all hit rerolls against things on objectives. They're definitely interesting in that they can move really quite fast, flip an objective with their objective control, and charge things that otherwise might be hard to reach. And it could be a bit more interesting in the new Slanesh detachment, though are the sort of unit that could definitely take a bunch of casualties if they don't embrace fighting first. Overall, I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. It feels like their main value is their fast-moving objective control, that they can still finish off injured units and bully lighter infantry when needed. On to the Aeldari next, who are going to be getting a codex of their own shortly. And first up we have the Guardians with their Guardian Defenders. The Aeldari troops move fast with a 7-inch move, get a 4+ armor save, and are armed with the Shuriken Catapult for a flurry of strength 4 and AP 1 damage up close. They can also take some pot shots with a Bright Lance platform, which works rather well with the Battle Host rerolls that they have at the moment, and are maybe a particularly useful unit to bodyguard a Farseer who might be supporting some other units by flipping those dice into 6s, ideally being able to tag onto an objective while they do so they can farm an extra fate dice each turn, making a single squad of these for a home objective into a fairly nice resource generator. Overall solid enough for 100 points I think. I've given them an 8 out of 10. I guess we'll see what the new codex brings for them though. Otherwise, their counterparts are the Storm Guardians, the same sort of stat line with OC2, the regular rank and fire ones perhaps being slightly disappointingly low threat. For some reason Games Workshop only gave them strength 3 AP 0 on those blades, which seems a bit weak, but they do get a few upgrades in the unit with a couple of flamers and fusion guns and power swords each. Their weapon platform gives them a 5+ invulnerable save, keeping them a little bit tougher. They're still kind of fragile for the points even with that, and their special rule is to give them the sticky objectives rule, again quite a handy one to just have at least once in the army. Could be another very reasonable retinue for a Farseer, though I'd personally be more tempted by the Defenders. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. Next up we've got the Harlequin troop, basically 15 points per guy for some fast-moving Aeldari close combat specialists, usually equipped with their Harlequin special weapons at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1. And they get a couple of fancy pistols in the unit as well, with a couple of them being able to take fusion pistols and a couple neuro disruptors. They're fairly punchy on the charge with a +1 to the wound roll, and sometimes get used as an escort for Ivrain and maybe the Vizark, if you're wanting a unit for them to run with, as they're quite valuable models that you could revive back onto the board, and +1 to wound helps out the damage profiles of them. Just on their own though, they don't really tend to have these sort of damage threat profiles to be able to take out tough stuff, and volume fire is still going to make fairly short work of them, even with the 4+ invulnerable save. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here, and I feel like it's a bit rare that you'd really want a troop master to be the actual leader of the army to make them battle line at the moment, given that you'd be passing up on, say, the Autarch command point generation. In any case, again, could be changing big time in the new codex. Finally, for the craft worlds, we have the Corsair Void Reavers. These ones are 60 points or 120 per 10 of them, and they're armed with some rapid-fire shuriken weapons, plus a clutch of special weapons and a fairly punchy wraith cannon. Otherwise, they're OC2, they can scout 7 inches up the board and get some rerolls against things on objectives. I feel like for the scout and special weapon sort of damage dealers sort of role though, they're really quite fragile for the points, and I've not seen loads of people use them in competitive play. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. I think they're a fair bit better since Games Workshop dropped the points cost on them, but still maybe not particularly stand out versus the rest in Battle Host, even if they can put out some fairly punchy close range shooting with Battle Host rerolls on a Wraith Cannon plus the other specials. For their Darkkin, the Drukhari next. First up we have the Kabbalite Warriors. These guys are 110 points and move dead fast for on-the-board infantry with an 8-inch move and are equipped with their signature splinter rifles, poison weapons to be able to prolong the suffering of their prey. Otherwise, the unit of 10 can take a whole bunch of special weapons, with a Shredder, Dart Lance, Shuriken Cannon and Blaster all thrown into the mix, so it can be at least fairly nice general purpose shooting, perhaps gunning out of a Raider, though they are quite nice in Venoms as well. That can split the unit in half, and their sticky objective rules that they get can actually be triggered when inside transports, which is kind of unusual. So that means that you could have some Drukhari gunboats scooting up to the midboard, and then those objectives are yours unless the opponent can take them off you with their models. Overall, between a nice bit of special weapon damage plus their sticky objectives, I feel like they're really good troops for the Drukhari and often get played in numbers in competitive lists. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Witches at 90 points, 9 points per model for some fast and fragile Space Elf gladiatorial fighters, attacking with their Hekatari blades at strength 3, AP 1, damage 1 with a loss of attacks with them, a 4+ invulnerable save that they only get in close combat, and the ability to trigger desperate escape tests if people try and fall back from them. On their own, without any buffs, they're not really all that strong, but get a lot better with Lilith Hesperax. When she's leading a big unit of 10 of them out of a raider, they get better AP and better strength, and particularly in Sky Splinter, they can also have the Lance keyword as well. Between that and a pain token, you've got a fairly general purpose unit that'll stack a bunch of wounds on just about anything. They will still be a bit better against lighter stuff though, versus say maybe Incubi, and units without Lilith just don't really seem to be all that great. I'd give them a 7.5 out of 10. Though perhaps a bit of a weird one given that they're so dependent on their special character, even if they are quite good with her. Finally for the Drukhari, we've got the Racks, the flesh creation troops of the Homunculus Covens, toughness 4 with a 6+ invulnerable save and a 5+ feel no pain. And between the lot of them, they're perhaps a weirdly shooty unit as well, with 3 different special weapons across a unit of 5 of them. I feel like they got a bit more interesting when they dropped a few points. I think that makes them a bit nicer for the small expendable unit kind of role that can still take a chunk out of the enemy. They've got the nice bonus that they generate a pain token when they kill something and also when they're destroyed as well, so even if they die you do get a bit of compensation. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. I still probably rate the Kabbalite Warriors higher for objective grabbing, but maybe not by all that much, and they could join a Homunculus or Urian Rakarth if they wanted to. Next up for the Tyranids, and first up we have the Termagants, perhaps their archetypical chittering horde, effectively 6 points per model, with either a smaller and skirmishing 10 model squad or a bigger 20-man one. They're not super impressive on the defence individually, with toughness 3 and a 5+ save, though it will take at least a little bit of volume fire to clear them. Their weapon options maybe aren't super well balanced at the moment, with the Spine Fist being the way to go for most people. Twin Links and Assault are both really quite nice for them, as is the pistol ability to fire them in combat as well. All of those help a lot. Beyond that, mainly people seem to bother with the Strangle Web, which gives you some devastating wound attacks as a torrent, but otherwise maybe not placing too much emphasis on their new special weapons. And their special rule gives you the ability to do a reactive movement, not too bad for trying to keep them a little bit safer when they're skirmishing on objectives. Unfortunately for them, the Horde-style Tyranid detachment isn't really in favour very much at the moment, following a couple of different nerfs. They're still played fairly regularly as Tyranid troops though for a bit of objective control, and they quite like lethal hits from Invasion Fleet or maybe even a nearby Turvigon, where they can punch up a bit with volume fire, but mainly are just very nice for putting loads of OC on the objectives. I'd give them a 7.5 out of 10 between all that. Next up we've got the Hormagaunts, which are 65 points per 10 or 130 for 20. These guys basically just move really fast and have OC2. A big 10-inch move will get them where they need to be. As if that weren't enough, their Bounding Leap allows them to declare a charge in a turn in which they advance. Their damage output's only really going to be all that great against lighter infantry at strength 3, AP 1, damage 1, but quite a lot of attacks at that profile. In general, they're handy enough for surging some units across the board, flipping objectives in the midfield, and then probably being wiped out in return, but not really too bad at 65 points for sort of trading units. I think they're also very usable. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 overall. Next up we have the winged and more expensive Gargoyles. They're 20 points more for a 10-strong squad at 85, but again have really quite fast moving OC2. They can move 12 inches, and then potentially go even further than that with move shoot move from their winged swarm ability. They won't really do all that much damage between their flesh borers and one attack in melee, but can be a pretty interesting disruption unit. You could potentially move them up the board and screen with them early in the game if you wanted to, or drop them down and use their move shoot move to get them to unusual locations, maybe even to be able to flip an objective or score a secondary. They tend to be pretty commonly included as a result, and they have a few more options in Vanguard Onslaught, as they have the Vanguard Invader keyword. Finally for the Tyranids, the Warriors can also be battle line in the Warrior Bioform Onslaught. Tyranid Warriors are synaptic linchpins as well as just general purpose weapon beasts, some intelligent alpha warriors of the hive mind. Their toughness 4 with 3 wounds and a 4+ save, and they have 2 different variants. This one's the ranged one, packing a venom cannon, a bunch of death spitter fire, and also having a bunch of bioweapon attacks in close combat, so can still bully lighter infantry there. Synapse can be helpful for them in a bunch of different detachments, and they can be one of the cheapest sources of that at just 65 points. In the Warrior Bioform Onslaught, they get a bit tougher and also can activate the stratagem to allow the rest of your army to ignore cover against a unit, and that easily feels like they can be worth including between that, particularly if you've got some other scary shooting to back up with it. Overall, I feel like they're solid enough, though still maybe not the favoured datasheets in the Warrior Onslaught. I'll give them a 7.5 out of 10 if they're ranked there. It'll probably be a bit lower than that elsewhere though. Otherwise, for the melee warrior bioforms, they're kind of similar but lacking the guns, and instead they get 6 attacks at strength 5 AP 2 with twin links, and that's a profile that just makes them far more general purpose, and in reality they'll be striking at strength 6 due to the +1 strength synapse rules. They get built-in reroll hit rolls of 1, and in general do have good enough damage outputs to make them a big threat to most things in the game, even if the damage one maybe does limit them a bit against some of the biggest, toughest tanks and monsters. Assuming that you are playing that detachment though, then you're going to be building around these guys really quite heavily most of the time. I give them an 8.5 out of 10 when ranked there, given that they have a lot of good support and do have the stat lines to get the job done, I think. Though they can be good elsewhere as well, such as the Vanguard Onslaught with a Winged Prime. Onto their cultist allies next, and first up we have the Neophyte Hybrids, 65 points for 10 big craniumed cultists, or 130 points for 20. They're OC2 with a sort of guardsman-like defensive profile with toughness 3 and a 5+ save, and they get quite a nice mix of special weapons, often with a grenade launcher, Weber, seismic cannon and mining laser all on the go. With a whole bunch of general purpose damage profiles, they could be quite nice for stat buffs, things like Ridge Runners and the Host of Ascension detachment, or adding in a Biophagus or Primus. There's a fair few good shooting enhancements that can be stacked with them and one of the characters. Otherwise, they also have sticky objectives, which is another good reason to take at least one set of them with their deep strike shenanigans, and can regenerate models with their cult icon, and overall I feel like they've got really quite a lot going for them. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here, though probably a bit more slanted towards the detachments that favour them as opposed to things like the Biosantic Brood Surge. Otherwise, for the Genestealer Cult, there's the two flavours of Acolyte Hybrids, 3 armed mutants with mining weapons, and divided into their options for either auto pistols and their close-range melee mining weapons, or their demo charges and hand flamers. Either way, they're toughness 4 with a 5+ save and OC2, and generally cheap, deep striking units that could either drop in to do secondaries or jump out of transports and hit things. The auto pistol version is the one with the heavy mining tools they fight with in close combat, a bunch of attacks at strength 5, AP 2, damage 3, with an anti-vehicle 4+. They can hit fairly hard in close combat with 3 of those and are quite general purpose, and they've got a good few detachments that can make them scary in various different ways. Even if you just have one unit though, maybe guarding a home field objective, then they can have a good chance to rustle up some extra command points to plug into some powerful stratagems from the Genestealer Cult detachments. Between that, they've got a few fairly good reasons to use them, and they also recycle fairly efficiently for the resurgent points at the moment. I've chosen to give them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Otherwise, for their equivalents with the hand flamers and demo charges, they cost 70 points, potentially throwing a couple of bombs at the enemy after they get out of a transport or something like that. Recently, the range on the demo charges was increased to 8 inches, even though it's listed 6 here. The demo charges aren't quite the utter destruction that they used to be, though still really quite nasty, in particular really good against things on objective markers where they reroll all wound rolls against them, and they are fairly explosive in the first place, with a whole bunch of strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks. Again, that can take a whole bunch of detachment rules rather well, even if they hit on 5s at base otherwise. They're also really quite commonly included in army lists. I've given them an 8 out of 10. For the Leagues of Votann, we've got the Hearthkin Warriors, 100 points for 10 kin, equipped in their void armor and with a good bunch of high-tech weapons. They're fairly sturdy with a toughness of 5, a 4+ save and OC2. And then they're equipped with either bolters or ion blasters, though the difference between them isn't enormous really, and a good bunch of special weapons. Really though, their damage output isn't particularly important. In general, these tend to get used to fill Sagittars for the most part, which can split the unit into 2 different squads, and then have them jump out to put down some OC and sticky objectives. And if they happen to do any special weapon damage along the way, then so much the better, though that's not necessarily a given. They do get sticky objectives as well, which isn't too bad for toughish troops for just 50 points for 5 models, once you've split them with Sagittars, which people generally want to take anyway for being fast shooting things with Scout. Overall, I'd say they're usable, but probably would be less so if the Sagittar didn't exist. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here. For the Tower Empire, we've got the Strike Team and Breacher Team for their 2 variants of Fire Warrior. The Strike Team got a little bit better when they got their Codex for 10th edition, being able to hand out a -1 to hit rule now. And otherwise, at 75 points for a squad, they've got okay defense for the cost with a whole bunch of wounds with a 4+ save, put out some pulse rifle fire for some strength 5 volume fire, and get a support turret, a drone support, and they have a marker light if it makes sense to do any guiding for anyone. In general, they tend to get fielded in fairly low numbers though, as they just don't really have general purpose damage output. Maybe one squad with an ethereal could be alright for a home field objective to safeguard him and take advantage of the feel no pain. I've given them a 7 out of 10 overall. For the ones that typically get used as damage dealers, that would be the Breacher Team though, with their pulse blasters, shorter range than the rifles by a long way, but 2 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1 with the assault keyword, and particularly in Montcar or Calyon they can have some pretty massive damage boosts, usually deployed by Devilfish to take the midboard, and they get 4 rerolls to wound against things on objectives, which means they can be wounding anything that's not toughness 12 most of the time. They get a boosted ballistic skill 3+ with those blasters that can go to a 2+ with guiding and ignoring cover, and there's ways to get extra AP as well, which will be nice against higher saves. Both these guys and the Guardian Drone also get a -1 to wound as well from ranged attacks, and that does make them at least a little bit tougher to take down in return, though in general Reacher team is still rather fragile and maybe a bit vulnerable to Overwatch if the opponent has got good stuff. Pretty scary out of a Devilfish though in Montcar or Cao Yon. I'd give these guys 8 out of 10. Next up we've got the Kroot Carnivores, 65 points for 10 of them or 130 for 20 of these alien auxiliaries. Fighting with Kroot rifles, reminiscent of their old fighting staves, but given a good infusion of Tau tech, they get to be battle line in the Kroot hunting pack formation. On the defensive, they're really quite fragile, though it might take just a bit more volume fire than you might expect to take them out in the hunting pack. They've got stealth and also a 5+ invulnerable save against range, and otherwise they've got volume attacks at range and melee that can deal with lighter troops, though not really too much else. Their fieldcraft gives them sticky objectives, which again is quite nice to have, and often they might get included for a single unit in a Tau list because of that, though in Kroot hunting pack they're going to be a fair bit more efficient. A good few shapers that are generally going to want to lead them. A 20-man unit can be a good target for recycling and putting back on the board, and they are just a bit tougher and stronger in damage and defense. If playing Kroot hunting pack to make these battle line, they're going to be fairly central, and I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. For the Necrons, their standard rank and file robot skeletons are the Necron Warriors, shambling low-grade serfs transformed into basic husks devoid of any souls or personality. They get a movement of 5, toughness 4 with a 4+ save and OC2, and they attack with the Gauss Flare or Gauss Reaper, the Reaper being shorter range but gets 2 shots at AP1, the Flare getting 1 shot out to 24. In general, their damage and defense aren't really particularly outstanding for the 9 or 10 points per model, but they are interesting in that they can be a unit that can take some leader buffs fairly well and reanimate quite nicely. They get to reroll reanimation rolls and just have a lot of models that could allow them to ping back to full health fairly well, maybe quite liking Awakened Legion in particular with reanimators and ghost arcs. Certain characters can lead them pretty well, including Orican the Diviner for the 4+ invulnerable save too. Overall I've given them a 7 out of 10, I feel like they're usable when supported, but not really particularly outstanding. In general, Immortals tend to get used far more, and I feel like the cheaper value on the smaller squad also just doesn't really tend to get taken too much. They generally want to be in units of 20 for big model support if they can. For their counterpart Immortals, they're the Necron Warrior Elite with much improved weapons and constructs. They're toughness 5 with a 3+ save, and armed with either the Gauss Blaster for some bigger lethal hits out to 24 inches, or Tesla for a bunch of stacked volume fire with sustained hits 2 and strength 5 AP 0. Out of the two I'd generally go for the Tesla over the Gauss, as it just has generally better damage output, and particularly when firing against things on objectives where they get to reroll the wound roll. Immortals tend to be one of the better synergy units for a bunch of different detachments, so if you want units for your leaders to lead and actually threaten to do some good damage, then they're usually going to be the better option versus the Warriors, and they can be supported quite well with Illuminor Serras as well if you want to, amping up their AP and worsening AP coming in return. They might like things like Hypercrypt with that Arisen Tyrant enhancement and maybe a Plasmancer for extra sustained hits, and Awakened has a fair few character combos for them as well. Overall I've given them an 8 out of 10. Lastly, we've got the Greenskins, and the Orks have 2 variants of boys, the basic lads armed with Slugger and Chopper and itching to get into the fight. For 80 points for 10 of them, they get toughness 5 and a 5+ armor save with OC2. Basically anything will kill them over time, but they can absorb a fair bit of fire, and usually tend to get equipped with Slugger and Chopper, often with a couple of rocket launchers thrown in for some cheeky shots that might splat the odd medium infantry. Their special rule is get the good bits and other sticky objectives equivalents, and fairly nice to have when they're jumping into the mid-board and scrapping for the mid-board objectives. They've got lots of good character combos, as you can attach more than one to the mob. They certainly enjoy Green Tide, which can still be pretty threatening, maybe with some War Bosses and Pain Boys attached. With a War Boss they can do well in Bully Boys with multiple turns worth of the War. They quite enjoy jumping out of a battle wagon if you want to get them into the fight that way. They're still very nicely fighty in the standard Warhorde, enjoying these sustained hits on all their attacks and being fairly good users of a couple of stratagems. Overall I'd give them an 8 out of 10, probably a bit more in the Green Tide when they're kind of carrying the detachment, going to stack loads of attacks against lighter infantry and a good retinue for some very fighty characters too. Otherwise we've also got the Beast Snagger boys as well, 95 points for 10 of those, so paying a 15 points premium over the regular boys. These are the Savage Orc equivalents obsessed with monster hunting. For that points premium they get a 6+ Feel No Pain and 1 pip of extra strength, so striking with strength 5 with a chopper normally or strength 6 during the war. The Nob gets a Power Snapper with more attacks but not quite as much punch as the Power Claw that the regular boys get. Their special rule is to be able to reroll hit rolls that target monster or vehicle units, and that can be really quite brutal when combined with a Beast Boss as well, who really enjoys that reroll boost when he's trying to take down tough stuff with a whole bunch of devastating wounds against monsters and vehicles on the charge. With a Beast Boss and a unit of 10 of these charging out of a transport, they should be able to absolutely ruin a big monster or vehicle unit, and still easily have enough attacks to clear up any hordes along the way as well. I'd give them an 8 out of 10 overall. Very nicely dangerous, though maybe not super tough for the cost, and certain volume fire can take out a very hefty amount of boys if they're exposed. Finally, last but not least, we have the Gretchen. Not normally battle line, but they can be in Dread Mob, so I thought I'd include them here. I think there was at least one Gretchen meme list that put just a ridiculous amount of these little guys on the board and managed to go 5-0 to Grand Tournament too. In general though, they tend to be fielded in units of 10, very weedy individually with toughness 2 and a 7+ save, but they are OC 2 and you do get a lot of them, so they're at least going to take some small arms but focus fire to focus down, and if they happen to be doing anything useful with their grot blasters along the way, then so much the better. The main value of these guys though is just a 40-point super cheap unit that takes a bit of irritating time to kill. Very nice for objectives and actions, and could flip an objective with their OC if needed. And perhaps more importantly, for that very cheap cost for the chance to gain command points. If they hold an objective, they gain 1 on a 4+, which could easily make up the unit's value if they do manage to trigger that once or twice per game for a squad just camped on a home objective. As a result, they're kind of utterly auto-include for Orc lists, and probably one of the most valuable units in the game for the points cost. Quite a lot of other armies would take them if they had an equivalent. I've given them a 9.5 out of 10 here. They're not really any less bad for the Dread Mob, where they get a fun reactive move stratagem. That could be kind of fun with Zodgrod Wartsnagger on the go, making them into super runts and being just a little bit more unusually dangerous with them. In any case, that just about brings us to the end of a look through every single Warhammer 40k battle line unit at the moment, and just a very brief overview of what they do in game. Let me know your thoughts as to the units and which ones you'd rate any higher or lower than me. Look forward to hearing your opinions down in the comments below. As mentioned, a big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring this video. If you do want to check out some fancy faction dice of one sort or another, then the link's below. They've got ones that could be relevant to a whole bunch of armies out there, so feel free to give them a look. And there's that Auspex code as well to give a 5% off if you did happen to pick up anything. In any case though, I think I'll leave this one there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.